Perry Mason takes on a case that is 25 years old. Chapter 3. Unfortunately for Sherry, and so on, the story continued. The police stayed at her home for over 3 hours this time, and she seemed to feel no longer comfortable. But they were still no closer to finding out what happened to Ralph on that horrific day. Sherry thought very hard and did remember that he had taken a couple of aspirins the night before, saying that he had a headache. To her horror, she thought about how little sympathy had she given her husband that night. After all, they were both working long, hard hours, and a baby was just born, and the stress could give anyone a headache. Ralph had left that morning at his regular time and had not said anything about having a headache. She had noticed nothing unusual. However, in her mind, she had to remember that at the time she'd been busy with the baby, and although they had kissed goodbye, she was busy and distracted at the time. How she would have to live with the fact that Ralph must have been very ill at the time. However, the two state policemen and Tom had seen many strange things since becoming a cop, and they were well aware that even a sweet little lady was capable of doing very bad things. And so, as the last person who had seen Ralph alive, Sherry was most likely the biggest suspect. Each and every day, the officers worked on the case, but could not get any further information. There were other suspects, but each and every one of them had not seen him on the night before or in the morning that he had died. If they had not found anyone that had witnessed it. Weeks had a way of turning into months, and Sherry's calls were now just passed to the operator. The police had no more answers, and they had other cases. This is when the case grew cold. Each of the officers placed everything they had in their journals, all the evidence they had found in the car, and packed it in a box and put Ralph's name on it. There would have to be some kind of break in the case or new technology to help them now. Sherry got so desperate that she hired a local private investigator. Although Mike had done his best, he too had come up with little or no information. But all his information was turned over to Tom and the two state troopers, Mike and Steve, who were still investigating the case. Tom had been working the case even when he was free and not on the clock at work. There was so much evidence, and a young man had been murdered in his hometown. Now it was time to put it behind him. Tom knew there was a chance that this case might never be solved. Benny was busy at his car lot and took a look at the car once more that had gone into the canal, carrying Ralph. It had now been in his yard for almost a year, and he was wondering if there were a time that he could bring the car to a salvage yard where it could be junked. No one in town wanted anything to do with it, and with all the parts being stripped by the state police and all the inside removed, it just wasn't worth even thinking about using it. It was all used for evidence. It just sat there and haunted his days. Fred, who was Ralph's boss, had continued working and cooperated with the police the best he could. The place where he and Ralph had worked together was a small business with just 12 employees. He had kept his ears open for any gossip, but even after he had died, the story had begun to growth in. At first, Ralph was the topic of every conversation at every meeting, everywhere. But there was nothing going on now, and he rarely even heard Ralph's name mentioned. Fred had been with Ralph the night before, and he was sure he was one of the suspects. For Sherry's parents, things had changed. Although they loved their granddaughter with all their hearts, they had never planned to have her in their home full time. It tore at their very soul that their child could be a suspect in a murder case. And they had loved Ralph. He had been a good father and husband, and had died so tragically. Now they had to face the fact every day that someone who had murdered their son was free. Ralph's parents, Mary and Joe, were devastated also. Ralph had been their firstborn son, and had always been the son that they thought was going to make something of himself. He was a hard worker and had been faithful to his wife and child. He had been a good dad and husband, someone that they could have been very proud of. Mary was in the kitchen, crying as she held the picture of her son. She thought about the last time she had seen him. He had not said anything about any problems that she had thought were out of the ordinary for a young man with a family. There had been some discourse at work about the shop possibly being sold, but that was all. Joe had been destroyed by his son's murder. When he had been only missing, he had hoped against hope that his son would call him and let him know where he was and that he was okay. When he hadn't heard from him in months, he had known in his heart that something was very wrong. He, too, had been a young man with a young family and had known the problems that could occur during this time. He would have stood by Ralph and had been sure that if his son would have at least tried to contact him. Who would have wanted Ralph dead was all the family and friends could wonder. As the years went on, the thoughts became further and further apart. Ralph's daughter grew up and got married. She was now lost her father, and her mother was in her 80s. Ralph's mother had died, but was said of a broken heart. Joe was going to be 90 soon. In chapter 3.